Hello and welcome to week 3 of ECON. I've gone back to the old setup here, mainly because it's a little bit easier to set it up, and I know the resolution's not quite as good as it was last week, but the file is a lot smaller to upload. It took me forever to upload it on YouTube last week. Hopefully this week it will not take too long. Our third unit lesson here on Econ is really the second part of a unit called God's Economics. Last week we looked at what primarily the Old Testament and over into the New Testament Jesus had to say about Christianity and the economy. Today we're going to pick it up just after the death of Jesus, the early formation of the church in general, Christianity spreading for the next 1,000 or so years. We're going to look at what happened in terms of Christianity in America. So it's going to be another history lesson. It's going to be heavy with Christian inferences, and we're going to kind of go more or less chronologically in the order of history to look at the relationship between God and the economy, and more specifically, God and money. The Holy Spirit led the first believers of Jerusalem to view their possessions as communal. If you read the book of Acts and the early church, you see lots of examples of this, and I'm just going to kind of paraphrase Acts 4 here to tell you what it was like for them. This is Acts 4. And the congregation of those who believed were of one heart and soul. Not one of them claimed that anything belonging to him was his own, but all things were common property to them. And with great power, the apostles were giving testimony to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and abundant grace was upon them all. For there was not a needy person among them, and all who were owners of land or houses would sell them, and bring the proceeds of the sale and lay them at the apostles' feet, and they would be distributed to each as any had need. Now, that sounds great. It also, for those of us with a history of living through the Soviet Empire, it sounds like communism. And in one respect it is. It is a communal way of living. Big difference, though. This was voluntary. You didn't have to do this. In communism, you don't have a choice. That is the absolute fundamental difference between the two, and that's why they are miles apart. At this point with the early church, to be a believer in Christ was to see all of your possessions as belonging to the Christian community. That is to say, belonging to God. This, again, was not compulsory. You did not have to join them. Much like Jesus, the early church was also hyper-focused on helping the poor. You'll see some of the passages in Acts in particular talk about helping the widows. Widows got no government assistance. They could not legally own property. They could not testify in court. So they really, if you were a widow and you did not have a male family member to care for you, you were very much on your own. The early church spent a lot of time looking into the problems of widows and, in general, the poor. The gospel had a major appeal, you would suspect, among those who were poor. And even though, again, we're told in Acts, people like Lydia and Cornelius were very conspicuously rich people who helped Christians. We're not told that Lydia and Cornelius sold their house and everything in order to join the Christian community. But they did use their resources for the Christian community. Their house became a place of meeting for Christians. Their money was used to fund Paul's missionary journeys. So, again, we're seeing that school of thought develop that, yes, you can have money and be a Christian. Your focus, though, is supposed to be on spending your resources on godly things and not on worldly things. As we look at the rest of the New Testament, of course, Paul had much to say about poverty. He walked the walk and talked the talk. And, of course, we remember his famous words in Philippians 4:19. God will supply all your needs according to his riches in glory in Christ Jesus. Paul even struggled, as later Christians did, with the concept of slavery. He did not call for slavery's abolition, which to our modern sensibilities seems wrong. But he did encourage a revolutionary relationship where the masters were supposed to see their slaves as God sees us, as children, so to speak, that you are supposed to love. So Paul didn't get to the idea of abolishing slavery, but his recommendations were nonetheless remarkable, particularly for the time. Basically, he's introducing a new way of looking at others in the eyes of God. Paul also in Thessalonians addressed the problem of Christians not working and thus not providing for their own needs like they should. Laziness is something that the Old Testament and the New Testament agreed was not a good thing. Later in the New Testament, the book of James, he condemned people who treated others differently because of their economic status, giving rich people, well-to-do people, the benefit of the doubt. He admonished his believers to engage in their business activities, not just their life, but their business activities with humility and subjecting themselves at all times to the will of God. Even when doing business, remember that God is number one and you're not. That was the admonition given to Christians in the writings of the New Testament. As we move from the death of Jesus past the New Testament writers into the first real century of Christianity, we hear from the early church fathers not a new view about Christianity and economics, but something else. Before I go on, we will hear over the next 1800 years or so, when it comes to Christians and money and the economy, we're going to hear both extremes of the spectrum. Suffice to say, in the name of Christianity, all kinds of thoughts on economics have at one time or another flourished. You'll be surprised possibly at some of these. The early church fathers warned against greed and the accumulation of wealth, not the possession of wealth, but the accumulation of wealth. Go so far as to call it a sin, but they warned against it, and for good reason. They also remember from the Old Testament, Jewish people were not supposed to charge interest on loans to fellow Jews. Yeah, the early church fathers were very, very much against usury like that. As Christianity began to become more, dare we say, normal, another movement began to crop up, the monasticism movement. For a lot of people, that persecution that the early church had was to them the way to follow God. You weren't really following God if you weren't suffering some. If you didn't suffer, you didn't care in their eyes. And so when Christianity began to become mainstream in certain areas, not only tolerated but accepted, there was a big branch of the Christians who said, well, we can't worship God like this when there's no oppression, when we're not paying a personal price for our faith. So they really separated from the world, became, for the most part, hermits. We call them monks today, and they formed monasteries. And part of that was to give away all your worldly possessions and live a subsistence lifestyle. To them, that was the best way to serve God, was when you did not have all of the earthly trappings of stuff to get in your way. Oddly enough, as monasticism began to become cool, and of course this goes for female monasticism too, think of nuns and nunneries, as that became cool too, a few people adopted it for the wrong reasons. They thought that by just simply taking that vow of poverty and joining a monastery, they were going to get into heaven. Just like that. Just like purchasing their way in. And if you were a very poor person, not to have many means, you're not giving up much by taking a vow of poverty. You're already there. And so if you just go join the monks and think that's going to get you into heaven, well, our works alone does not get us into heaven. It is faith in God as well. So what began as a movement of penance became a way to try to earn your way into heaven for some. Like any other good movement, it's going to have bad actors eventually. As the church or Christianity took a very, very cautious view of conspicuous wealth. Ironically, the Catholic Church became the richest institution in the world. It was amazing. The Catholic Church had more money, had more land than most kingdoms on the planet at the time. So, kind of an odd dichotomy there, but again, it's what happened. And as a result, it's not a coincidence that the richer the Catholic Church became, the less Christ-like they became, which that and many other factors led to the Protestant Reformation, led by Martin Luther. He rejected many of the church's practices, including the view that poverty was especially meritorious in God's eyes, that being in poverty or living in poverty was somehow the ultimate virtue in God's eyes. Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation held that someone who's a carpenter, a baker, a homemaker, mother, anyone can live their lives to the glory of God just by doing what they do, by fulfilling their calling from God. They are good in the eyes of God. You don't have to take a vow of poverty. You don't have to break off and live on a mountaintop somewhere in order to be good in God's eyes. You don't have to cut yourself off from the world. As the Protestant Reformation gained steam, some of its biggest adherents also adopted thoughts on how people should economically obey God. John Calvin, for whom Calvinism is named, had no real problem with the accumulation of wealth or even charging interest on loans, as long as you did not oppress the poor and as long as you didn't cheat anybody. John Calvin thought you were probably okay. Now, at that time, another subsidiary of the Protestant Reformation, the Anabaptists, criticized them for not doing enough to help the poor. And so here you go. You see the cycle squirming again. At that time, the Quakers, a very large Christian faction, many of them were very successful business people. Let's go to the New World and Christianity traveling to the New World. And the first major sect of Christianity in the New World were Puritans. And quite frankly, a lot of what we now call the modern Christian work ethic, that is to say, how Christians view economics and life today, a lot of it has its genesis really in the Puritans of the 17th and 18th centuries. On the whole, Puritans saw money as a good thing because it was part of God's creation. Nothing that God creates can, in and of itself, be evil. We are supposed to, as followers of God, to be good stewards of what God gives us. There's that word again. We're going to be saying it a lot. We have said it a lot. Their view was that money in and of itself was not evil. God created it. How can it be evil? We are supposed to take care of it, though. And they, like Martin Luther, believed that people using their God-given talents to make an honest living is good in the eyes of God, and that is exactly what we are supposed to do. And any success you get from your trade, from your livelihood, is because of God. So it is good. They also said poverty was from God, and that it was good. Why? Because for some people, they needed poverty to bring spiritual growth. Remember the early monks we just talked about? It was their view that being poor got you closer to God. The Puritans had a very practical view of it. They said that, money's fine as long as you're using it to honor God and you're being a good steward. Poverty is fine as long as it's bringing you closer to God, as long as it's making you godlike. It provides an opportunity for believers to draw closer to God. Some can do it with poverty, some cannot. They did understand it, the Puritans, though, that money can be dangerous because it can replace God as the object of your devotion. Money can cause a person to rely on himself instead of God. Remember the gesture I made in class quite a bit last week? This as opposed to this? That's the way the Puritans saw it. When your relationship with money becomes this and not this, that's when we have a problem. Puritans sought a balance between honoring God as first in everything and in making a living, earning money, what have you. Their priorities of hard work, basic, simple lifestyle, and moderation would lead to economic success in their eyes. And it kind of underscores the way we probably believe today that, yeah, go ahead and make plans, fill out your budget, do things the right way, but know that in the end it all belongs to God. And you're just a steward. Let's fast forward another century or so as we get into the 19th century here in America. During the 19th century, the first half, Christians were mainly involved in slavery. Most churches called for the abolition. As you could understand, churches in the South had a somewhat different opinion. And a lot of that had to do with economic reasons because the large section of the South's economy included slavery as its labor source. So abolishing slavery was as much of an economic question as it was a social question in the South. Now, in areas where it was not an economic question, it was strictly a moral issue. The church struggled with the question of slavery. It depended upon where the church was located. When Nazi Germany was developing in the 1930s, the Catholic Church had struggles with that. Some priests were killed. Others kind of adopted an uneasy truce with their circumstances. We can equivocate a lot when we're scared, when we don't follow God, when we don't place Him as number one as opposed to us. If we're thinking primarily about our safety, yeah, we'll reach a tentative agreement with somebody doing bad things just to survive. If we're following God, though, we can't do that. Anyway, don't want to get too preachy here. In terms of economy, we're talking economics here. We saw in the late 19th century very conspicuous industrial growth. Christians, now no longer with slavery to be concerned about, began to be concerned about work conditions and the like. They began calling for social reform. They even went beyond economic and issues in terms of promoting prohibition and income tax. That was definitely an economic concern. The Christians of the late 19th and early 20th century, the predominant Christians were decidedly to the left politically and saw themselves as an agent for change, but they also saw the government as a potential agent for change. This was a very big shift in thinking. Christians and the government was almost an afterthought in some respects, but now Christians were beginning to realize that this big entity that is becoming bigger can do an awful lot of good, and we gonna make it bigger. And that really hasn't stopped, but that's another story. At this time, Christian institutions like the YMCA began to form as Christians saw themselves as the main vehicle of social and, yes, economic change. In 1905, German economist Max Weber published one of the most important books really to modern theology. It's called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Now, capitalism really developed over this time. We mentioned the factories that were, and the Industrial Revolution was largely fueled by capitalism. Now, Weber defined capitalism as an economic activity that expects a profit and generates usually a profit through peaceful, voluntary, mutually beneficial exchanges. Today, that is called almost libertarianism, which is where I am. Peaceful, voluntary, mutually beneficial. That's what it is. He saw capitalism as a rational economic system. He saw it as a moral economic system. Why? Voluntary, peaceful, mutual benefit. That's the way Weber saw it. A couple of other things that were evident in Weber's work, and it really took hold, so much so that the Protestant work ethic is a phrase that is still used today. Much like Martin Luther and the Puritans, he saw your vocation in life as not just service within the church, but as a calling. Remember that idea that your work is your calling? Weber was very big on that. Also, much like the Puritans, he believed that discipline and hard work, that Protestant work ethic, led to making money and was a legitimate way to honor God. A vow of poverty was not impressive to Max Weber, but doing your usual thing, whatever it is that God has called you to do, doing that and doing that well honors God. Weber, though, rejected what he called personal luxuries, which led to businessmen, instead of buying for themselves, they would invest in their business quite often. In Weber's stance, he rejected opulence on a personal level, so the businesses in his mind's eye would be bigger. And of course, his idea was as the business gets bigger, you can employ more people and have more people work out their calling to God. The worth of the individual, which led to greater economic activity in Weber's eyes, and which also led to a commitment to political freedom, which in turn, if you are politically free, if you've got a free mind, you are free to do better economically. You can tell I'm pretty fond of Max Weber and his Protestant work ethic. He doesn't address poverty directly. He doesn't denigrate being poor by any respect. And as a matter of fact, it is through this accumulation of wealth you can use that to help the poor in Weber's stance. But if you're not working to fulfill God's purpose for your life, then you're probably not going to have much left over to help the poor. His idea of espousing capitalism helped capitalism grow, but really what helped capitalism grow was that it worked. It was, at its best, a peaceful, voluntary, mutually beneficial exchange of goods and services. It is the most moral way to do business. It is not compulsory. If capitalism is working correctly within a robust free market, you're going to have plenty of competition for goods, and prices will be at their absolute lowest. Now, again, we've discussed the downsides of capitalism and how we have to safeguard against them. But yes, after Weber's book, capitalism became much more ingrained into the economy. Number one, because he liked it. Number two, because it just dead gun worked. Now, there were some other Christian philosophies that began germinating in the 20th century, which took hold in some places that were very much unlike Max Weber. Liberation theology was very big with some sectors of the Catholic Church, and still is today, mainly in some of the Catholic Church's poorer areas, Latin America and Africa in some cases. It really adopted the opposite of what Weber pushed. They adopted basically Marxist thought. They saw the early church as the proper model, where everyone chips in and for all for one for all type thing. Big difference. Not voluntary. Liberation theology does not allow for voluntary cooperation. They promoted Matthew 10:34, I did not come to bring peace but a sword, which they interpreted as supporting political revolution. Their idea was liberation of the poor from poverty by those oppressing them, and as liberationists, the oppressors were capitalists, not just government officials, but anyone who owned anything conspicuously. They saw wealth as a finite thing, and if someone owned this big a piece of the pie, then there's no way that anyone else would have a bigger one. The whole idea of expanding the pie was foreign to them. Again, a very, very hard-left philosophy. There's lots of shortcomings with liberation theology. First and foremost, they're going to bring Jesus into it. Jesus did not come about to bring a political revolution. Matter of fact, he disappointed a whole lot of people because he didn't want to overthrow Rome. Secondly, quite frankly, capitalism is voluntary and is not a tool of oppression. Capitalism has lifted more people out of poverty than all other economic systems combined, and it's not even close. Marxism is not, as we've unfortunately discovered with lots of experiments, Marxism is not a way towards political liberation. It's not a release from poverty. Instead, it is a generator of poverty, of misery. Liberation theology ends up focusing on political and economic conditions of the world and has very little to say about spiritual realities. Again, as we talk about Christians and economic theory, we're going to get to another extreme here. Theonomy, Reconstructionism. The modern day word for this is a theocracy. Basically, the idea that the church should rule all of society. Well, it's a controversial philosophy, as you would understand. Many Christians do not support it, simply because the Bible nowhere says that the goal of the church is to rule society. Jesus heads up the church. The church is the means by which we serve God. It is not the way by which we rule society. Also, they conveniently don't mention who would lead this reconstructed society. Now, we see in other countries places where religion and governmental leadership are one and the same. Iran is a theocracy. Yes, they have a president and a parliament, but the real power lies in their Ayatollah, who is a religious official. They are very much ruled by religious principles. The next to last lesson in the unit is titled Economics for Today's Christian. Studying economics is not necessarily a theoretical endeavor, although we've looked at it from a theoretical standpoint. It's not just an academic exercise. It involves how we live and how we make decisions every day. It tries to anticipate those decisions. As we look at it from a Christian standpoint, though, it can get murky. What I'm going to do for the next few minutes is kind of a rapid-fire presentation of some of the vexing questions that we as Christians today are forced to wrestle with as we reconcile our Christianity with modern economic realities. This is not going to be easy. This is going to bruise your brain because there are a lot of questions here. A whole lot of stuff we're going to talk about on Monday. But for the next few minutes, just try to let these marinate in your head. Think about them. Replay this portion again if you want to, because there are some very good and vexing questions that we have to ask these days if we consider ourselves Christians, modern-day Christians, participating in an economy. Remember this, too. There are good Christians who can answer these questions in very different ways. And you're both good Christians. That's how hard some of them are. What standard of living should a Christian have? We've heard a lot in history about whether you should adopt poverty or strive for riches so you can help poor people. Should you aim for a subsistence level lifestyle or something a little bit more comfortable? Should you go for the greatest income that you can possibly acquire, with the goal being to use the profits to help others? How should a Christian be engaged in the world economic scene? Should we withdraw from the world as much as possible, participate in the small group economy that the early church pushed? Should we store up supplies and cash to tide us over in periods of emergency? Modern-day Mormon philosophy teaches that stockpiling of goods for emergencies. What's the best way that an individual Christian or church can help the poor? Do we do it by campaigning for political candidates and parties that we think will be friendlier to the poor? Do we boycott or picket businesses that we think are abusing the poor? Do we assume that Christian business people are going to run their businesses in a Christian way? The most conspicuous example today being Chick-fil-A, famously not open on Sundays. Should we avoid using or selling products that are made in nations that are hostile to Christianity or hostile to just basic human rights? Should we, as Christians, try to grow our business constantly, or should we be satisfied at a certain point? Should a Christian business's main goal be to make a profit and provide for your workers, or using those profits to serve the community? Do you have to choose one or the other? More questions are coming up. How should a Christian business person use their profits? Should they make a capital investment to expand and hire more workers and make more people happy and well employed? Or should you send that to the church? Should you take your family on a vacation, or should you give it to poor in missions? Again, we deal with these questions all the time. If we're going to call ourselves Christians, we have to wrestle with these questions. Is a Christian guaranteed financial success? There are trains of thought that suggest that if you are rich, it's because you have God's favor. If you are poor, then God must be punishing you. Other schools of thought, like the Puritans, who said poverty could very well be a way for you to get closer to God, and there is no shame in it. How do we as Christians in today's world fall on that issue? How do we define financial success? How do we reconcile it with God? Spiritual success clearly is God's most important concern, but God does promise to take care of his people, right? Parable of the lilies, etc. And God will sometimes provide for us through the generosity of other Christians. Do we sit back and wait for God to do that, or do we take the bull by the horns, so to speak, and do it ourselves in the name of God? We are told that God will provide for us, but we're also constantly told in biblical scripture and interpretation that we should work, that there is a certain virtue in working. We've seen instances where God's abundance can be thwarted by disobedience. The nation of Israel found that out on more than one occasion. We could inaccurately blame problems, economic problems, on a lack of faith. Is that a proper way to view it? Again, questions we struggle with. Issues involving the broader economy that we are participating in as Christians. Should every person in the economy be able to feed and clothe their family? What is a living wage? Are we morally obligated, spiritually obligated, to provide a living wage for everyone? This is a question that's going to be coming up as we debate the national minimum wage question. Do we want a smaller, more efficient, less intrusive government to maximize individual liberty, or a larger, more activist government that can directly address the problems of poverty and living wages? Do we want more government regulations on businesses to offer basic protections to workers? Or do we want fewer government regulations to make businesses grow more easily and, as a result of that, gainfully employ more of us so that we can work to God's favor? What about economic stimulus, encouraging businesses? Should wealth be distributed? Should it be redistributed? If not, what the heck are the poor going to do? And if we do redistribute it, to what extent? How should it be done? Should it be done through churches, charities, compulsory government policy? What is your view of corporate executives who have large pay and benefit packages? Should the government force them to spread the wealth, so to speak? Should they force them to pay a certain percentage to their workers? If not, how can workers make more money if there are no impositions on the business owner? These are all legitimate questions. And again, good Christians, good people, will reach different conclusions about these. That's how vexing they are. We cannot leave our faith outside of our work. We got to take it along with us. We cannot leave faith outside of our participation in this thing we call an economy. It's got to come with us. We'll wrap up by trying to tackle one of the biggest questions in terms of applying Christianity and Christian principles to economics. What is greed? We know greed is one of the 7 deadly sins. We know it's a bad thing. But when does the desire for a profit become greed? I'll take you back to this famous scene in a movie.
The point is, ladies and gentlemen, that greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works. Greed clarifies, cuts through, and captures the essence of the evolutionary spirit. Greed in all of its forms. Greed for life, for money, for love, knowledge, has marked the upward surge of mankind, and greed, you mark my words, will not only save Teldar Paper, but that other malfunctioning corporation called the USA. Thank you very much.
Now, of course, as we later find out in Wall Street, Gordon Gekko, the character here played by Michael Douglas, most certainly operates under greed. But this is one of the most famous scenes in American movie history because it does tackle a very basic question. Uh, what is greed? Is the idea of working hard to make money, is that greedy? Okay, how about this much money? Is that greed? How about this much? How about this much? If we try to attach a dollar sign definition to greed, we will fail because there will never be anything resembling agreement on it. There's no way. I mean, if this is greed, why is this not greed? If this is greed, why is this not greed? There's no magic point. For a Christian, greed can only be defined in one way. Remember our gesture? When your thoughts about money and economic well-being emanate from here and not from here, it's probably greed. When you continue to look here first and not here, you are probably exercising greed. Now, again, that is a fluid definition because we are human. Sometimes we look here and then we correct ourselves and look up above. So, again, even in a Christian perspective, greed in and of itself is a very difficult thing to define. The Bible, of course, has lots to say about greed. The Ten Commandments, and a couple of them, greed of any sort is expressly prohibited. A lot of the late Old Testament writers admonished Christians who were being greedy, and one of the things greed leads to is taking advantage of people in compromised situations. We know what Jesus and John the Baptist had to say about the tax collectors of their day, who were infamous for cheating people in addition to merely collecting taxes. We see examples in the early church of greed being punished. Probably the most conspicuous examples of what we would call greed in the American economy were the so-called robber barons of the late 19th century, those who built the great railroads and steel industries, whose names are sometimes synonymous with wealth: Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, etc. They were infamous. Not just them, but several others who were captains of industry were infamous for not only creating these great businesses, but using cheap child labor to do it, paying people well below what would be considered by any standard a living wage. Again, were they greedy though? I'll submit that's in the eye of the beholder. The consensus, of course, would be yes, because if you're going to take advantage of people, you're no longer looking up here. You're looking here. And when you look here, in an economic sense, you're probably engaging in greed. The downside of capitalism is that it sometimes rewards greed. Not all the time. But it is an economic system that, if left completely unchecked, will reward greed. There have been catastrophic losses for people due to greed. The 1929 stock market crash was primarily due to unscrupulous investors over speculating. We'll get into stock market speculation a little bit later, but suffice to say, greed had a major, major role in the Great Depression formation of the 1930s. To a lesser degree, I believe, greed had a lot to do with the recession of '07, in terms of a lot of people greedily thinking they could purchase things, mostly houses, that they could not actually afford. Again, as you'll hear this many times throughout your life, money in and of itself is not evil. Money is just a tool. The desire to possess money is not evil. You got to pay the bills, you have to eat, you have what Adam Smith calls your own enlightened self-interest to try to satisfy. You have children, in some cases, you have to feed. There is nothing ignoble about wanting to earn money in order to meet those obligations. There's nothing immoral about wanting to have a little extra money to purchase a nice dinner every so often. Nothing evil about that. Again, we get into the realm of evil when we start approaching economics from here and not here. That sounds simple, but there are times when, where are we looking at? We can justify, hey, I'm really looking up here. No, you're probably looking here. We should always struggle with that. We should always ask, who are we doing this for? Me or God? It's a tough question to answer. Again, greed is an attitude. Greed is placing me before God when it comes to economics. If you are thinking primarily about yourself in an economic sense, you are almost certainly going to be greedy, as God would define it. Greed is potentially in the hearts of all of us. It is tempting. No one wants less money. We all want more. That's natural. So as Christians, we have to make sure we're looking up here as much as possible. Because if you're pointed up here, more often than not, you're going to be less likely to be committing greed. You can be comfortable that your desire to make a little bit more money is not greedy if you are working from the standpoint of doing it for God, of thinking of God first. Greed has negative consequences. It is one of many sins. All of them have negative consequences. If we're doing it God's way, though, if we're putting everything through the filtering through the prism of God and not through the prism of me, then you're probably going to be okay. All right, I'm going to take my preacher's hat off here, and next week we're going to get back into a little bit more standard econ as we look at a brief economic history of the United States. And yes, we're going to be talking capitalism's free markets. Mwah! Things I dead gum love. Y'all have a great weekend, and we will see you on Monday.